Right, so we are officially recording, and hi and welcome for our class number 3, which we're calling Heat and Sweet. It's a food and wine pairing workshop, of which we are on week 3, and I'm going to share my screen now. Oh wait, before I do that, let me just, oops, hold on. Before I do that, I want to share, since it's recording, this plate with a little tossing of Tabasco. Hopefully you can see it. It doesn't have to look this way. I'm the instructor, so I have to be over prepared. Yours can look like any variation, or it can just be that you're here and you're learning, and you don't have to have any or all of these things. And so hopefully none of these things stress you out. Please don't stress out about not having the things that we have, okay? So we'll go ahead and share screen now. At any point, if anyone wants to participate, describe what they're having. When I go into the experimenting phase and I tell you, hey, try this and that, if anyone wants to volunteer instead of only hearing my feedback and saying, hey, I'm trying this, I don't know, Tabasco sauce, and I have this Riesling, it really brought out X or Y, feel free to just either put in a chat, hey, I'd like to talk, or just like literally unmute yourself, okay? So please, I always want to hear from you all. Share screen, Sweet and Heat, sharing now, from beginning. And what I'm going to do now is just mute all the participants, just so we don't have any dogs barking, you know, Ruby's going to bark at some point, and she's the only dog that we have to hear. Hopefully she contains herself this class, but we know that's not going to happen. All participants muted for now. Great. Oops, nope, don't want that. Okay, everyone, so we're back. And I see, all right, so today's class is, I had so much fun preparing for these classes. I really do. It's one of my favorite parts of my job, my career, if you will, is not only food and wine pairing, because that's really fun, but also teaching and sharing passions, and also learning, because learning is still important when you're a teacher, to just figure out, you know, how do you communicate, how can you prepare, how can you really get people excited and share the things that brought you to wine. So to me, they're community, they are storytelling, they are history, geography, and food and wine pairing is so exciting. We have to understand that there's different cultures and there's different tolerance for things. And so something that works for me or that I think is fantastic might not be the right thing for you. And that is 100% okay. We have individual preferences, and we grew up eating and drinking and experiencing things in our own, with our own palate. So some people might not feel that things are spicy. It's not spicy enough. So you want more spice. And so you'll adjust your pairings to your palate, because that's what's right for you. And some of us don't really love sweet things, so we might enjoy when the sweetness of a dish is minimized by something in wine. So no right or wrong answers in wine. It's really our opinion. So let's get started. If you haven't already, cheers to your neighbors, and welcome to Monday, the new Friday, as my friend Galen says so perfectly. And today's class, as we just discussed, is food and wine pairing for spices and heat. So what I asked is not that you need to, but if you wanted a protein, you can make a protein. Today I didn't even make a protein. I'm just going to do mine without, just with sauces and spices, which I think is totally fine. But I recommended some different ways that you can make your proteins. Tabasco sauce is what I have here, my little Tabasco sauce. I have barbecue sauce on my plate. I had an A1 sauce. I didn't put any sugar, but I have a little bit of sugar in my mish, which I'll explain in a minute. And I got 3 pieces of chocolate on my plate just because I wanted to eat chocolate before dinner. Yeah, that's an excuse. Oh, I'm doing food and wine pairing. It's like in the middle of the afternoon and I'm like, oh no, I'm pairing. I can't really decide which one goes better with the chocolate. Another piece of Venki chocolate comes my way. And then for the backpack wines, if you did that, we sent you a bottle of Donhoff Niederhauser Hermannschule Riesling Spätlese 2017 from the Naha in Germany. Remember, we're pronouncing things not because we're trying to say you should be intimidated, but because we realized that with wine, hearing it might be helpful. So I remember the first time I saw this producer's wines, the wines of Danhof. He's one of the best. It's one of the best wines from the Ambagebiete, which is the name of a region in Germany called the Naha. And I remember I was so excited about speaking my German wine language. Like I said, Predikat Wein, meet Predikat. And I remember because Danhof has all these single vineyards. So they have Schloss Spackelheim in Kusegrud and Oberhauser Buch. And so I don't speak German, but I speak German wine very well. So just as a note on German pronunciation, not that this is a class on that, but anytime there's two vowels together, as in the case of Riesling, it's R-I-E, we might imagine that we silence the first vowel and we pronounce the second. So the reason it's not Riesling, which would be, you know, a very legitimate way to look at it and say, oh, well, that's kind of like the English way of saying it, because R-I, you would pronounce the I, but in the case of German, it's Riesling. And that could be really helpful when you're looking at other things that might have two vowels, right? So Niederhauser, Hermannscholl. If you're looking at Niederhauser, you can see A and U. Well, A has the umlaut as well. So we're pronouncing the U, okay? It's just super cool, and it applies to everything that you see. The other thing I want to point out, just because the name and the label is here, is when you see a German name that looks like very big like this, Niederhauser Hermannscholl, the Niederhauser Hermannscholl, it's like the village is the one that has the ER after the name. So in this case, Niederhaus is the name of the village, and the single vineyard is the one that comes after the ER. So for example, Niederhaus would be a village, and when you're from the village, you're called a Niederhauser. So for example, you might see the village of Vellen in the Mosel, and when you see the single vineyard, you will see Vellener, Sonnenner. So it happens all the time. So if I ever said, Lynn, hey, which is the name of the village on this bottle of Danhof, you would look for the name with the ER, and you would say everything except the ER. So, oh, this village is named Niederhaus. And what is the vineyard name? Oh, it's what comes after, Hermannscholl. Okay, so that's pretty cool. So we have the Danhof, we have the Raffinelli Zinfandel from the Dry Creek Valley of Sonoma. And then we have this Domaine de la Casa Blanca Banyuls. So Banyuls is a region, AOP, within the area of Roussillon in France. And so we'll hopefully get a chance to discuss these. I just wanted to point out, they all have very different alcohols. So the alcohol on, at least on this Riesling, is only 8.5%. So it's quite low in alcohol. So what would we imagine if it's low in alcohol, it would have a ton of? And the answer is residual sugar, because in order for it to have such low alcohol, AKA 8.5%, the sugar must be left somewhere, right? Because the job of yeast is to take sugar and eat it and turn it into alcohol. So in the absence of alcohol, we would imagine that there's residual sugar. So that's the Danhof, 8.5% alcohol. So quite sweet. It's the Spätlese, or the second level of ripeness in terms of Qualitätswein mit Predikat. In our Zinfandel example, we're at 14.5% in this particular vintage. This is showing 08. Obviously, we sent 17. It was just a label photo. But this alcohol is, you know, for Zinfandel, it's not as hot as some of the others. This is a producer that has been making wine in Dry Creek for quite a while. They're very classic Zinfandel, but before the big Zins that we knew. So it's not like that inky purple Zinfandel, which, by the way, is not a trend that we see as much anymore. But this is kind of like what we expect when we had a lot of the Italian immigrants coming to California during the gold rush, and specifically this family did as well. They brought with them some cuttings of grapes, perhaps from, you know, Italy. There was a thought for a long while that Zinfandel was related to Primitivo, which was then linked to the Croatian red grape, Surliana Castellanski. But in our Zinfandel example, we have sweetness in the form of ripe fruit. This Zin doesn't actually have residual sugar, so there's no sugar, but the perception of ripe fruit, of dried fruit, of figs, of raisins, of blueberries, of pie stuffing, that's all there, along with some sour notes in our Zin, which we'll kind of understand. And Zinfandel is one of my favorite red grapes, along with Grenache and Nebbiolo, and I have so many favorites. But the reason I love Zin, especially for these kind of pairings, is we do get this idea of uneven ripening, something that the French would call millerandage. So the idea that a cluster of Zinfandel doesn't ripen evenly. So in the shoulders, you might have some green grapes, and then you have some shriveled up raisins and some date kind of, or sorry, shriveled up little grape. So what you get in the finished wine is something that has like the fig and the raisin and the peach and the one of my really dear friends who's a master of wine, Lisa Granick, used to say apricot marmalade is how she got some Zinfandel aromas, which I thought was really good. And you imagine like barbecue sauce and apricots, that's pretty cool. That goes well. The sweet and tangy, you know, that could be really nice. So the idea that a wine can have sweetness and be still tangy is very interesting to me in Zinfandel. And then last but not least, in this case, Domaine de la Casablanca. This is 16.9% alcohol. This Banyuls is 100% Grenache, and it's an area in the south of France. And so we do have fortified wine. So fortified meaning to make stronger, right? So when we say we fortify our bodies with minerals and vitamins, we mean we're making them stronger. When we say fortification in winemaking, that would be that we would add brandy to wine. And sometimes we're doing that to make a sweet wine. Sometimes the original way that, or reason people probably did fortification was to preserve the wine for long travel. So port, Madeira, Banyuls, other what we call VDNs or Vin de Natural, they're wines that started off as a regular red wine. In the case of Banyuls, take your grapes from this region in France that overlaps the dry red wines of Collioure, and you have your Grenache, and you fortify it, or sorry, and you ferment it, and you have wine. If you were to, halfway through fermentation, if you were to spike, let's say, your barrel of wine, spike it by adding brandy, and the brandy could essentially be a neutral grape spirit. I've used terms like aguardiente, which is basically like a grape distillate. So you take a distillate and you add it to the fermenting wine. What will happen is the yeast will not survive after you spike the wine with brandy, and they will die, and then you will have residual sugar. So in the case of sherry, if you think about fortifying wines like sherry, the ones that are dry are the ones that are fortified after fermentation is complete. So, you know, if we were doing a sherry class, we would be talking about Palomino, these dry sherries, and we would add brandy, but we would add brandy once the wine was finished fermenting. In the case of Banyuls, we're doing it during fermentation. So it's very cool. So good stuff. So what I would recommend, whether you have these wines or any of these wines, so you could have any Riesling you want. Take a nice swirl or any wine and smell what are the things and flavors that you would associate with a really good Riesling. So we've used terms like stone fruit, things that have pits. So mine does have some apricot, some white peach, some underripe citrus. So I do often find in Riesling variations of lemon and lime. Sometimes you get petrol, which we've talked about as being a characteristic called TDN. So you might smell a little petrol or mineral, stony, slate. This particular Niederhauser Hermischol, it's a volcanic soil, black slate. So I'm smelling a little bit of like a rocky minerality. Okay, when you take a sip, you're reminded that the beauty of Riesling is the juxtaposition of acidity and sweetness. So depending on which Riesling you have, you might have more sweetness. In the Hermantoll, we have a significant amount of sweetness, but we still have this racy acidity, like a really perfect, well-made lemonade, right? And you can imagine Riesling is a really good, versatile wine that can go with a lot of different pairings, especially when there's ever acidity in a dish and sweetness. We often do find those, right? If we order some takeout and we get some duck sauce, maybe we have something spicy in our like Szechuan food, Riesling, really beautiful together. Okay, so the idea is to taste all the wines on their own and to note to yourself how fruity they taste, how sweet they taste, how acidic they taste. And if I was in your room and I was asking you, for you, what do the wines taste like on their own? So as I'm smelling my Zin, I'm reminded that, wow, it smells sweet. It smells really fruity. And if I gave this to some of my friends or some of my colleagues that they really like earthy wines, that they're used to drinking like really funky wines, they would be like, oh, this is too sweet. So the idea between fruitiness and sweet is that we don't taste the residual sugar on the tip of our tongue. So there might be the teeniest bit of residual, but like literally small. But I do taste this fruity nature. And a lot of people have this misconception that Zin doesn't have acid. I feel this one. It's really nice and green, almost savory even. I love Zin. The characteristics remind me of white fruit, red fruit that's dried. Like I was talking earlier about peaches and plums. So peaches and plums, like the other day I was eating a plum and it was dripping down my arm. I had to lean over the sink. And that's like the type of fruit that we get in Zin, like overripe, sometimes dried, sometimes baked, sometimes jammy. We're making a sauce right now with peaches that we are cooking down. So when you are using descriptions like cooked fruit, that's the idea. You're cooking the fruit down on a stovetop and concentrating it. Okay, and the banyuls. This is like almost like saying like it's an alternative to port wine. They make it in the same style. This banyuls is made in a reductive style, so it's very much like port. So you have, even more concentrated black fruit and even more dehydrated and raisins and blueberries and plums and all those beautiful things. Okay, let us talk about just the dorky details, right? So see, sometimes I mess up. Sweetness is not a naturally occurring polyphenol found in plants. That was the description for tannin. So ignore the red. Everything else is correct. I sometimes use my templates and then I forgot to change that. So we know what sweetness is. Sweetness can be in food, it can be in wine. Sweetness refers to the presence of unfermented residual sugar in wine. And like I said, it's different than the ripeness that you get in New World wines and New World fruits. Sweetness should be gauged immediately, really well before the structural elements that we think about that influence its impression. So sometimes we'll say wine is not that sweet, but it has, 50 grams of residual sugar, 220 grams of residual sugar. It's because the acid is so high. So you really want to think about sweetness separate from acid, maybe describe that first, because acid tension can distort residual sugar. High levels of alcohol tend to exaggerate sweetness. So if you imagine, if you figure out your banyuls at the higher levels of alcohol, you feel alcohol, right, in your chest, the same way you feel heat. It kind of burns, it goes up retronasal in your nose. You might feel it, you might smell it. Ooh, makes your nose kind of like go alive, make alive, get alive. So carbon dioxide in sparkling wine suppresses sweetness. That's why we really don't detect even when we have demi-sec or other sweeter styles of champagne or sparkling wine. We don't really notice it as much because the bubbles take away from that. Oops, I didn't mean to go. Yeah. So definitely initial impression of sweetness. Sugars in fully ripened grapes are the dominant soluble solution. They're capable of reaching concentrations of 200 to 250 grams per liter and more. So that's going to be 25% of the total of a wine. So when we say, oh, this, you know, Aussie sticky, this Tokai, this Muscat from Rutherglen has 250 grams per liter of residual sugar. Just think about that. That's a lot of sugar, 25%, right? This is a high concentration. So we have our scale, thanks to Guildsom, of some of the wines that we might see with sweetness. Clare Valley Riesling is in the more bone dry. When we're looking at terms in Germany, we see Trocken, we see Halbtrocken, those are dry terms. Then you have your Cabinet, which can be off dry all the way through like the Rieslings we have, Spätlese, Auslese. And then you get into the medium sweet categories or the lusciously sweet, like your Beerenauslese or your TBA, which are Trocken Beerenauslese, right? Austrian Riesling, they're kind of more of the drier style. Then we have, oops, I keep doing that by mistake. Then we have our Vouvray Sec. We know sec means dry, but then the demi-sec is a little bit sweeter. We have terms like milieu, which is like, you know, somewhat medium dry or half sweet. And then we have the Chenin Blanc styles of Côte de Chaume, Alsace Riesling, Bondage Tardive, and Selection de Grand Noble. Those are more of the sweeter style. We can see Amarone, that's a red wine that we might find is dry in terms of table wine, but it definitely has that riper fig-like, very similar to Zinfandel. When we get into Recioto della Valpolicella, that's where we get medium sweet. Those are the styles that we see, you know, into dessert wine. And you can see we have Moscato, Moscato Boom de Venise, and the different types of Madeira. I love Madeira. I'm kind of obsessed with it. I think we all should be drinking it every night. And so we have some Cercial Madeira, which is a drier style, but then the Wall and the Malvasia and the Port. And as I mentioned earlier, the stickiest of sticky is the Rutherglen Muscat, very sweet wines, almost like PX sherry. And when you want to have something really, really sweet, like a glass of wine to pour over your vanilla ice cream, that's what the Rutherglen Muscats and the PX sherries are for. Pedro Jimenez. But that would be a really, really, really sweet dessert that you would need for that. Otherwise, wow, the wine would be too sweet to overwhelm the dessert. Okay, so here we have spice, and I love hot sauce. I'm sure you all do too. And so you can have any hot sauce that you want when you're experimenting. It doesn't have to be Tabasco. I was thinking pulling out every single hot sauce in my fridge. And so we know that the term spice means aromatic vegetable, something that's whole or broken or ground. So we do have spices other than heat, right? Savory spices. So I listed a few of the more common ones, and you can imagine cooking with these things and layering them, right? So you have maybe something like sweeter in the spice category, and then you layer that with a little bit of maybe heat. So you can imagine taking fennel and horseradish, and you have the spice from the horseradish. We have wasabi as well. So some spiced peppers, jalapeno, poblano, serrano, scotch bonnet, you know, those are really, really spicy depending on if you eat the seeds or not. So again, you can imagine cooking with those things. So as I'm discussing these little spice kits that if you got them, we sent, it's a good idea to refresh your sense of smell from tasting and smelling things in nature, things in your cabinet. If you don't know what rosemary smells like compared with sage, this is my advice. Go and get your cabinets open, and you know, there's a reason I have like 5 things of cumin in my fridge because, or my spice cabinet, because they're all buried, and so I might as well do something with them, right? So go open your spice cabinet tomorrow morning and smell things. But with ours, the first one that I sent was the Concale. This is salt, fennel, orange zest. So I like to take a little bit of salt, whether it's this one or another one, and I'd like to remind you that acid and salt negate each other. So maybe for your experiment, you'll take a little bit of orange salt if you have it, or your regular salt, and take a sip of your Riesling. Wow. So all of a sudden, I bring out the salt and my acidity on my Riesling dissipates. So I remind myself, okay, that's pretty cool. What about if I took, if you remember, I sent, and again, it could be sugar, but there's a blend in this spice pack called Mish Mish, which is actually honey, lemon, and saffron. On this, my friend that makes these at La Boite, he says you can put it on fruit or dessert or pork. So I actually say, if you have it, taste a little bit on your own. Imagine what honey would do if you don't have this. You get this kind of honey and lemon taste in this one, and then you get a little bit of saffron. So now I would do mish mish and taste a little bit of our Riesling. Now my wine tastes more dry. Now, it's not that it tastes bone dry because the Riesling has a decent amount of sweetness, but having something sweet in my spice, and you could do the same, you can have some sugar. You just taste some sugar and taste your Riesling. Your Riesling will taste more dry. So you can do that with fruit, right? You can take some dried fruit, apricots that are dried, some concentrated, sugar, sweet, and have it with Riesling. Sometimes when people say, oh, I don't like Riesling, it's too sweet. I say, okay, how about we grab a little bit of a sweet sauce and then we try it. Maybe you will like Riesling. And so that's really important too, right? So two sweets, they can make each other taste less sweet. So the sugar in my honey, saffron, lemon blend takes away some of the sweetness in the Riesling. Now, if we were evaluating sweetness for an exam, we probably wouldn't want that to happen, but you can imagine the next time you go and you're having foods that have sweetness in them, let's say plum sauce with some of the takeout food I get, we have duck sauce, plum sauce, things like that. Sometimes I don't really feel like I want a really sweet one. I want to make my wine taste drier. So that's a nice idea. You can mix some salt. Imagine you can have orange salt in the fennel blend, and you could put it on, if you had pork, you could take salt, you could put the little bit of salt and sugar together. So what I'm doing is I'm taking the Cancale salt, I'm putting a little bit of that sweeter. So you can imagine salt is going to elevate flavor. Well, that's really nice. I might take some salt, take my pork, put some of this like honey, saffron, lemon blend, and then all of a sudden it's Riesling ready because all of the extremes in my Riesling are balanced. Now maybe I can now see really the minerality in my Riesling because I took some of the acid away with my salt. I took some of the sugar away with my sweet, it could be just straight up sugar that I'm using. And now, wait, I'm seeing like all of this minerality and all of the nuances besides sweet and acid of my Riesling. So that's exciting. Okay, so you might have in your blend some Tabasco sauce. So, or you have any kind of spice. We also have Shabazi in the kit. This one is a blend of green chilies and cilantro and garlic. So if you're reminding yourself, remember I told you I do that? Sometimes I sniff so close it gets up in my nose. Okay, well, I got a good whiff. Oh, it smells like spice, the chilies, right? So I might take a little bit of the Shabazi if you have that. And notice how it's spicy. And notice that the garlic, even garlic, we don't often think about it. Garlic is earthy. So we have kind of like a spice and an earth. We can think about, well, as I take a little taste of that, I feel the heat slowly creeping in. We know that some heat doesn't affect us right away. So I might want to take away that heat I'm smelling. So I take another kind of taste of my Riesling. We often say the low alcohol beverages, you know this from beer drinking, they take heat and they tame it. So when I have something really, really spicy, I want to drink more of my my wine or my beverage. So having a low alcohol wine is somewhat helpful. And also, the lower the alcohol, the more you don't feel the burn of the wine and then the burn of the spice. And it is true that there is sometimes people that love to smell high alcohol wines with spice. So you might want to do that just for alcohol, knowing if you have one that my Riesling is 8.5%, or any, it could be, you might have one that's 10 or 12, or it's still low by standard. So I have a little Tabasco, and it's really tangy as well as spicy. So thinking about our class on acid, whoa. Oh, you see how I need some Riesling. I can literally erase my spice and my Tabasco with a little sip of Riesling. I still get the acid in both beverages. So the acid in my Tabasco is quite high, and the Riesling is quite high. So if I was making wings, red hot wings, and I was making a lot of like vinegar type bases, I want to consider that too, which is why, again, Riesling is so just so well versed for these kind of spicy things. But if you want a good experiment, see your port wine, your Madeira, your high alcohol, you might have a Zinfandel that's 17%, 16% alcohol. So take a little bit of Tabasco. We know that our dessert wine has residual, so that will help in terms of the sweetness. I like that pairing. I really do. There was like a football tailgating pairing class that I did one day for the Super Bowl, and I had all these guys drinking with their barbecued wings with blue cheese and spicy wings. I had them all drinking Bougie Cerdon. If you're not familiar with Bougie Cerdon, it's a wine from my nose is so burning from that Tabasco and the alcohol combo. I'm feeling now all the alcohol in my nose, and my palate is going back, right? But in the Bougie Cerdon, it's a wine from a grape called Plussard from the area near Jura, the Arbois region. And it has a little residual sugar, but it's got concentration and it's bubbly. Oh my God, it's so good with wings. So we can think outside the box there too. Okay, so what else is going on? Let's remind ourselves structure in wine, the body of the wine, the body of the dish, the weight, and the alcohol. So yes, of course, we have spicy dishes that are light, and we have spicy dishes that are full flavored. So when I think about curries, sometimes we have like a curry, maybe our Indian food, or some types of Thai food, we use coconut milk. And the idea is that these kind of milks, whether they're milks or yogurts, they cool the heat. So those could be paired better with things that are equally textured or thick, if you will. So I think about some of my favorite pairings with like massaman curry, which I made last night, or like Penang curry, things like that. I love like all sauce Riesling, because I have the texture of the Riesling to match this very mouth-filling texture in the coconut milk. And so you can have some heat and spice and body, and you can think about them all together. So what I thought we would do also is, so in the case of the Zinfandel, like I mentioned, it's fruity but not sweet. If you have A1 sauce, and you try your A1, or you could do with barbecue too. They kind of go hand in hand. A1 is just a little more, I guess you can call it earthy, or has umami. But I love that barbecue sauce. So mine was like, I think it was called the bone sucking barbecue sauce, right? And so it has sugar. I mean, you can imagine ketchup too. When you taste ketchup, it has like a sweet tangy kind of combo. So I want you to try, remind yourself what the Zin tastes like. And when you taste the Zin, pretty fruity. Now taste the barbecue sauce and taste your Zin. Tastes to me drier. To me, wow, where's all the fruit in the Zin? You might like that, you might not like that, but one of my favorite things to do is in Calistoga in Napa Valley. You know, I think I might have mentioned once before, my husband and I got married there, and there's this great barbecue place. I mean, when you go to Calistoga, you'll just smell it. I'm drawing a blank on the name of the barbecue place, but like literally it's the only barbecue place in Calistoga. It's really small. It's right off the main little square. And you smell this smoke, fat, hickory barbecue, right? And we would go across, because if you think about the northern part of Napa and Sonoma, you know, Napa, Sonoma are parallel. So there's this redwood forest that goes across. So you can spend the day in Sonoma and drive over through the redwood forest down to the northern part of Napa, which is Calistoga, which is what we did. And you go to Raffinelli in Geyserville, and you have some barbecue spare ribs, pork type base, and barbecue with Zin. It's one of my favorite things. I also think like you just have a burger, and your burger is medium rare, and it's like filled with flavor, and you put some ketchup on it, and it's a Zinfandel pairing. And not that that's the only thing Zin can go with, but so have the Tabasco, and then have the Zin. So try that out. So you have the Tabasco, and it's spicy. You take the Zin. So it mitigates, takes away the Tabasco. It doesn't taste as spicy. My mouth is relieved by the barbecue, or by the Zinfandel, and then it slowly starts to creep back, the spice. So the initial fruitiness of the wine takes away the spice. And then if you think that any of your wines they show too much alcohol, you know, salt kind of lowers the perception of alcohol. So I can take a little salt, and I can try my Zin. Wow. Also, my wine tastes more in balance with a little bit of salt. So we can imagine the same thing as in our cooking. When we're tasting, this is not like, oh, the only way to enjoy food and wine pairing is to have the components. What I want you to start thinking about is, oh, most of the cooking I do has a little heat, has a little spice, has a little sweetness, has a little salt. This is kind of what we're doing with these experiments. So if you have the Shabazi, that green little herbal chili blend, if you have the Zin, I often think sometimes Zin has a little green aroma when I'm describing Zinfandel. Sometimes I will say it smells like green as well. So it has like almost like an herbal leaf, tomato leaf. So try your spicy green and then have your Zin. You'll see how much green comes out in the Zin. Very interesting. I love this. Okay, so it's very fun to see. Okay, if you have Anna, which is that blend that we sent, sumac, rose petals, toasted sesame. What did I do with Anna? Let's see, Anna and Madeira. Ooh, or Anna and the Banyuls. So I also had some Madeira earlier today that I poured, and Madeira, I often say is something it's really cool to smell because, and it could be tawny port if you have tawny port, or it could be something oxidized. So the reason that Madeira is a unique wine is Madeira is one of the only wines that is fortified, which you know, other wines are fortified. So added brandy, you pick these grapes from the island of Madeira and you fortify them just like we described with the Banyuls. But Madeira takes it a step further because they cook Madeira. So they take these barrels of wine and they're trying to replicate what was a voyage across from the island of Madeira, owned by Portugal, to, let's call it, England or the UK. So what would happen is during the ship, when the ship was sailing across the Atlantic, it would be in the hull of the ship and the sun would bake the wine. The wine was fortified so it wouldn't spoil. But the sun would actually cook the wine, and the wines tasted so different. They were cooked in the sun. So nowadays you have something called an estufagem, which is a hot room, or you can age your barrels of Madeira. So they when we say a wine is Madeirized, that means it tastes like it's cooked. If it's not Madeira, it shouldn't taste Madeirized, right? So we're using the name as a descriptor. But if you have Madeira, it smells like nutty, and there's something like almost toffee or almond, or just kind of like savory but also sweet. If you think about the spice of Anna, which is the one that came in the spice packs, if you got it, it has rose petals, it has sumac, and it has sesame seeds. So if you have something nutty in your dessert wine, maybe it's Madeira, maybe it's tawny port, and you have that, or you can try it another day. You can imagine, let's take this Anna, like we'll take the sesame seed, or if we have sesame seed and sumac at home, and we'll rub it on, let's call it pork, or maybe we could use like it in a sauce, and we could have Madeira, and we could make a Madeira taste dry. Jason Wise once told me, you know, Jason Wise, maybe you've heard of him. He's the director of the Somme Films movies. We were talking about food and wine pairing. He said he had port wine with a hot dog. And it's like crazy how you can have, and I was like, oh, that makes sense to me. Port wine is concentrated and intense. And if you put a hot dog with ketchup and you had like a decent amount of like sweet toppings, and I could see. And he was like, yeah, it's funny because the port wine doesn't taste as sweet when paired with savory foods. So I would say if you wanted to try a couple of things, Madeira, it tastes like a, or, you know, Madeira port, the banyuls that I was talking about, it, you could try, imagine you could take your mish, your honey and sugar blend, or just sugar, and you could try it with your dessert wine. You could try your barbecue sauce with your dessert wine. Anytime I introduce sweetness with my dessert wine, the dessert wine tastes less sweet. So my barbecue sauce combined with my dessert wine, it almost tastes like a really fruity, dry wine to me. Okay, so here's another idea. What about desserts, like actual desserts? So we have here some chocolate. I guess it depends if you have dark chocolate or milk chocolate. I have kind of both. I have a little bit of milk chocolate in the middle here, and I have a dark chocolate here. So I like the idea of trying Zinfandel with dark chocolate. And you can see, again, your dark chocolate, your Zin, they're kind of along the same lines in terms of they're both like dry earth. So if you have Zin and you have dark chocolate on its own, it's almost like the dark chocolate suddenly has a cherry inside. It's so crazy to me. If you have a tawny port or a Madeira or even the banyuls, so you try your Casa Blanca banyuls, try it with dark chocolate, will you feel as if you just ate a chocolate covered cherry? It's crazy. It's like the actual wine makes it taste like a flavor. So I often find myself like I prefer having a piece of dark chocolate. So this is something that I did. I took a piece of chocolate and I had it with my banyuls, and I thought, wow, that does taste as if I just had. So have it with Zinfandel and chocolate, see what you think. Have the Madeira banyuls port wine with chocolate and see what happens. One thing that I like to do, because I love salt, I like to take salt and put it on my chocolate.
And so I could take some salt and chocolate and then try it. Maybe the acid in my wine is going to decrease a little. Sometimes when I pair chocolate with Madeira too, I feel like I just warmed up my body from the inside. So I feel like, you know, those chocolate molten cakes, the flourless molten chocolate cakes that you smell them and it smells like warm chocolate. There is something about heat in alcohol that smells warming. It smells like kind of like it warms you up. You know how it smells when you, have you ever had like high alcohol proof like bourbon or 151 and you take a smell and it feels like it warms you up? There's something to be said about wine like that too. So I smell sometimes these fortified wines and I have them with chocolate and I almost imagine that all of a sudden the chef brought out a warm chocolate cake. It's really amazing how your mind goes even like that for temperature. So we're reviewing, you remember the weight, the food, they should match. If the wine is lighter bodied, must be powerful in flavor and have high enough acid to stand up to the food. Alcohol balances weight and the body and the food, and spice, as we imagine, exaggerate. So the best thing you can do if you're a spice fiend and you love spicy foods is dial up the alcohol. It really will exaggerate the alcohol. So if you want that burn, you love the smell, then you can go ahead and do that. And we already said, sometimes oak can give you the idea of sweetness. There is something in toasting an oak barrel that mimics the sweetness that you find in the descriptors we use are cinnamon, nutmeg, clove, baking spices for oak. So if you did have, like I mentioned, maybe a sweet dish where you were using, like in Thai cooking, sometimes you have palm sugar used, and the palm sugar can have a sweetness. So if you had something sweet in your sauce, you could imagine using an oaky wine that could kind of mimic some of the spice, especially if the texture was right. So like I said, I think about, oh man, if you want to understand mole sauce, think about having, if you want, you could even do this without any kind of wine pairing. Have a piece of chocolate, have a little spice from the Tabasco and salt. So if we were making like the really good mole sauces, we would have different types of cocoa or like pure chocolate, but you would have salt and you would have spice. So that is a really nice thing to explore, just how spice and sugar, even in a Tabasco covered chocolate bonbon and some salt, how nice that could be. And imagining that if you were making like I said, we went to Mexico City a few years back and we had the most incredible mole sauces. Those are so complex and hard to pair. I might do like a late harvest wine like the Casa Silva Bañuelos. I don't want you to pigeonhole just dessert wines into only having with dessert, because that's a lot of dessert wine to have, right? You know, so you could imagine thinking about these different sauces and things that have sweetness and actually making your dessert wine work for you. We talk about sometimes these crossover wines, like a wine that you can have from dinner to dessert, and the ones that have residual sugar, like Aussie Shiraz, California Zinfandel, Amarone, Priorat, maybe some California Pinot Noirs if they're really like sweet. They can go from entree to not as sweet desserts. So if I was like in the Amarone camp and I had a bottle of Amarone, 16% alcohol, figs, raisins, dates, I just finished my steak. Maybe I used a little bit of like a sweeter sauce for my steak if I was having Amarone. So I had like, you know, a poivre sauce with butter. Just think about butter from last week when we learned about fat, how butter can also be sweet. So we have this au poivre, béarnaise, whatever, this rich sauce in my steak. I have my Amarone. Everything's going well. Now I have 2 glasses left of Amarone and I want dessert. What I would not recommend is getting the extremely sweet dessert, because I would recommend maybe getting the dessert that reads a little less sweet, right? So what are the less sweet desserts? Things that have nuts. They kind of take away some of the sweetness because they're salty. Of course, blue cheese is a great idea, right? Something really funky. If you had something sweet in your wine, it's like the blue cheese becomes like a fig. The wine becomes a fig for the blue cheese. So you could have like a dark chocolate dessert, or you could have something that had cacao instead of full-on milk chocolate. So it's really fun. You remember our components, the food, the sauces, the condiments, the sides, but the method of production, cooking method, low cooking in our barbecue sauces, concentrating things more and more. When you concentrate something, it becomes sweeter. So I think about short ribs. And when I think about short ribs and cooking them in a slow cooker or cooking them in my Instapot, how I can concentrate the flavor, how I can make red wine concentrate and make it sweeter and reduce it down and down. So those are things that I'm going to be thinking about as I'm looking at those richer reds that are fruity. I often think sweetness in, I say this all the time, in food and wine pairing, summer and maybe even spring, and this is a generalization, so please know that there's exceptions. Summer and spring, they go better with New World wines, and fall and winter, they can kind of, as an overall, they can be better. I mean, I'm talking about produce when it's at its peak. So I'll give you an example. This is a really fun pairing. Take your next Zinfandel. It could be tomorrow morning for lunch. And yes, I'm authorizing you to drink wine leftovers on a Tuesday at lunch. But you can have a really beautiful, ripe heirloom tomato and just cut it, leave it in a bowl, put some salt on it, and have your Zinfandel. It's unbelievable. The sweetness of the tomato with the sweetness of the Zinfandel. It's really a great pairing. If we had tomatoes in December, which probably we wouldn't do, and they would be green and they would be hard, those are tomatoes for Sangiovese from Tuscany. Those are acidic green tomatoes that are savory and smell almost vegetal. When I think about corn and lobster and things that are at their peak sweetness, so remember, like if I told you spring peas, they are so ripe, they taste sweet. We know that there's not necessarily residual sugar, but if we had a Sauvignon Blanc that was so ripe, it tasted sweet, that would be really nice with our spring peas. So right now I'm eating a lot of corn, and the corn is so ripe, there's no butter needed, there's nothing needed. It's almost like the peak sweetness of the corn, so that it could be really beautiful with the California Chardonnay. Whereas maybe if I was using corn that wasn't in season, I might have a white Burgundy, right? And again, these are just like, you know, my opinion. So here's some ideas for dinner. Riesling goes well with spicy foods, off-dry sauces, sushi, of course with wasabi, you want to cut some of the spice. Pork, high acid foods, duck. I love duck. I love sauces with fruits and Riesling. So depending on how sweet your fruit is, your sauce would depend on how sweet your Riesling should be. For Zinfandel, we talked about it, but barbecue, ribs, burgers with ketchup, dark chocolate, lots of cheese, lots of chocolate sauces, really good with Zen. So we have medium to full-bodied, blueberries, figs, uneven ripening, sour fruits, soft tannins, high alcohol in some cases, but this can apply to Primitivo or wines from Croatia. If you haven't had the Zinfandel kind of parent grapes, Sirlianek, Kastelanski from Croatia, definitely recommend that. That would be like if I used a lot of vinegar in my barbecue sauce, I might want the old world Zin, right? And then I wanted to show you a picture of the beautiful island of Madeira. This is a picture of Funchal, which is one of the cities in Madeira. So this is Madeira, ports, banyuls, fortified sweet wines that are high in alcohol. They can have coffee or chocolate or caramel. They can, when paired with the wines, it can be as if you have
fruit in your dessert. And we often see chocolate served with nuts or salt or ice cream, vanilla flavor. If you think there's another California Chardonnay that you've had that you think is really, really sweet or really, really fruity or very oaky, maybe trying it with a piece of chocolate. It's a very interesting pairing. We did a chocolate and wine pairing with white chocolate and Chardonnay, and it was really well received. It was like it was a pistachio with white chocolate and California Chardonnay, and it was like, wow, the California Chardonnay, you have to make sure that the chocolate is not so sweet. Otherwise, California Chardonnay will taste sour. But it's a kind of a fun pairing if you're into experimenting. All right, so let's stop the share and let's hear if anyone had some eye-opening moments that they want to share with the group. So stop share. Would anyone like to speak about anything? We're about 3 minutes out, so we have some time to hear from you. Feel free to unmute. Anything that.
Hi, Laura. So I was really kind of surprised that I didn't like the barbecue sauce and Zin pairing.
Okay.
The drier part of the Zin took away something from the barbecue sauce. So I'm thinking, to your point, when it comes to herbs, I may probably like that balance better. But
Yep.
that dry feeling of the Zin, it really took away a lot of the sugars, the smokiness away from the barbecue sauce. And I have about 3 here. But I'm thinking more on the earthy side. That just might be a better option for me. But I really didn't enjoy the Zin and barbecue sauce pairing for some reason.
Right. And isn't it cool? You might have liked one by itself, but together you didn't like it. So were you looking,
Correct.
it's like, well, why am I going to do that? If I'm taking the sweetness away from barbecue, I might as well just be having a vinegar-based sauce. Like I enjoy the sweet. And then that's the thing, right? If we're going all out and we're having like the best barbecue sauce that we could possibly have, and there are definitely competitions amongst who makes better barbecue sauce and the different styles, but if we go and have something that takes away the barbecue-ness of it, that's not going to be a good pairing to us. So it really depends. Now, if like I often find this when I give somebody an extreme wine like Zinfandel or an extreme wine like Riesling, if they don't like sweetness, they're immediately like, no, I'm not having this. So I used to do these wine profiles at Corkbuzz where we would give everybody like 8 different wines, and we would kind of try to figure out by having these tastings if somebody loves something in a wine. Like I love tannin, I love acid, but I hate fruity wines. And Zin was one of the extremes that we would use, and somebody would say immediately, like, I hate that. It's too sweet. It's too fruity. It's too jammy. It's too cooked. And if you gave them barbecue sauce, they would like the wine better. But the problem is we're looking for the barbecue sauce to shine, Jean Wesley. So I think you're right. I think that's not a good pairing in that case. That was great. I'm so glad you shared that. Any other thoughts?
I really enjoyed the Zin and dark chocolate.
It's like, wait, twist my arm, dark chocolate? Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
It actually works very well. I wouldn't have, like initially, like when I still had some of the heat from the earlier spices on the palate, it was like a little off-putting. But then after I did like a rinse and whatever, then it was just like, okay, wow, like it's showing, it does like, it cuts down a little bit of, the fruitiness, but like it draws out more of that earthiness that I personally like. So,
yeah.
So it was good to me.
I love that. I'm loving my favorite thing really, and I don't know if this is just me being crazy right now. My favorite thing is the dark chocolate Tabasco salt combo with my banyuls. I'm just like in love with it. I'm like, whoa, the Tabasco. And so I'm thinking, of course, I'm not gonna just randomly sit and drink Tabasco sauce and chocolate and dessert wine, but I am thinking that the next time I make like a mole sauce, I'm gonna open a dessert wine instead of a regular wine. So anyhow, we're exploring different things. Melissa, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, so I've got a black muscat as my sweet dessert.
Yeah.
It's not fortified, but it's got a 15%, and it's really super sweet for me to just drink it.
Yep.
And I've had it with chocolate, but tonight I did like a brown sugar Dijon mustard sauce, and it's fabulous because mustard's really hard. But add a little brown sugar, it totally cuts the sweetness, but then there's enough of the sweetness, and then the heat kind of comes on the back end. Really, really fun. And if you add a little salt to your chocolate with the black muscat, it totally cuts the sweetness because it's super sweet for me. So
that. Well,
I've had this a few times, but I've always usually had it with something that's a little too sweet.
yep.
So cutting the heat, super fun.
I'm loving that you said that, Melissa, because I think that muscat, black muscat, and also a lot of these late harvest wines, sometimes I find them cloying or like unctuous, like those sweet, like cavity inducing, like my dentist is getting me after I do this. And you're right. It's like all of a sudden, and the way you're describing it so perfectly is, okay, so now it's not as sweet, and now I can enjoy it, which I really, really love. It's actually, that to me is even better because all of a sudden the wine is more friendly.
Yeah, I would totally grab it next time I put that on salmon or pork or something, just for fun.
It's funny that you did the brown sugar and mustard. My husband does this salmon dish all the time, which is what made me think of this series, guys. The reason that I started this was because one day he was making brown sugar, mustard powder, putting it on salmon, and we just had a Riesling open, and I was like, this is incredible. But if we had an even sweeter wine, and there are days that he puts more brown sugar or he puts less brown sugar, and when he puts less brown sugar, it's not necessary to have a dessert style wine, but that's really super cool. Yeah, you know, and I would imagine that winemakers would really love the thoughtfulness of making dishes that make their wines better, right? So again, I say this sometimes in my restaurant, and it sounds like not what I mean, but I say, who's paying, right? Meaning, like, okay, what's the most important thing? Is it the food or is it the wine? So a winemaker's paying the bill. They're entertaining journalists. We're gonna make them look good. A butcher or my friends, I have these friends that have this family farm called Seps, and they are incredible, like, agriculture farmers. They have the best produce. So if I was doing some like wine pairing for their produce, AKA they're paying, right? It's more important that I can show how incredible their watermelon or their tomato or their peaches are instead of how great my wine is. So that's really to consider. And it seems like, you know, the black muscat producer would be like, oh yeah, please serve mine with a brown sugar rub, mustard blend. Thank you. Okay, well, that concludes our class. For those of you that are joining, well, I think everybody is, in this series next week, we're doing a little bit about the business of wine, but we're gonna do wine, service, temperature, storage, the 3-tier system, which of course talks about, you know, how wine gets from winery to distributors and importers. It's not going to be boring, I promise, but we're going to talk about, like, what are the jobs one might get if we were looking to be involved in wine as a profession. But if we're just still just looking for entertainment, you know, what are the prices? Like, why is wine sometimes more expensive? And so you'll imagine that the business of wine could be really informative, even if you're not going into this as a business. So with that, I will say happy Monday is the new Friday. Cheers. And
Cheers.
good to
Thank you.
see everyone.
Thank you, Laura.
All right. Bye, guys.
Laura, awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Everybody.
Laura.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.